Folks, I'm going to do a little discussion for you about Betaflight filters, gyro low pass hertz, dterm low pass hertz, and yaw low pass hertz. There have been a lot of questions about how these work. They're probably one of the most fundamental things that Betaflight brings to the table. Certainly one of the first things that Betaflight brought to the table, literally, was the ability to filter these things other than just the default way that we always had. And it's been one of the biggest performance gains, and let's talk about why, and let's talk about how to configure them. I'm going to be doing this presentation in the form of a PowerPoint slideshow, just words on the screen to help you follow along with what I'm saying and for you to use as a reference. No fancy graphics or anything like that. Hope that works for you. What is a low-pass filter? A low-pass filter is like turning down the treble on your audio. If you think about what happens when you turn the treble way down and you only hear the bass, that's a low-pass filter. You're cutting the high frequencies, you're letting the low frequencies through. Why do we do that to a gyro? We do that to a gyro because the frequencies of interest, which are the actual copter motions, are low frequency, and unwanted noise, which is vibrations from props and motors, are high frequency. And we should clarify here that the term noise is being used not just to mean audible noise, although certainly you can hear the motors and props, obviously. But what we mean is vibrations, background vibrations that we don't want. That's what it's called, noise in this domain. So we want the PID loop to respond to actual copter motion. We don't want the PID loop to respond to noise. When the PID loop tries to respond to noise, the motor outputs get really jaggy. The motors get hot because the motors are being told to move faster than the motors actually can. And that energy, since that energy is not converted into kinetic motion, it's got to convert to something else, and it converts to heat. Okay, so when you send the motor a signal that is moving faster than the motor can change, that results in just turning to heat inside the motor, and the motors heat up. The motors can even desync if the motor signals are too jaggy for the ESC to keep up. But generally, the effect of inadequate filtering is hot motors. Okay, so when you have too much noise and not enough filtering, you get hot motors. And sometimes you get smoked motors or ESCs. All filtering creates a delay in the filtered signal. In general, the more heavily you filter the signal, so in other words, the more rejection of unwanted noise, the more delay is imposed on the signal that gets through the filter. Low passing a gyro is so common that the InvenSense MCU chips that we use have a built-in low-pass filter. In other words, the company that made these chips said, of course you're going to want to low-pass this. In fact, we're just going to build that functionality into our chip. And the reason this is significant is that it lets a designer implement filtering without it having to actually write any of the code that does the filtering or use their own processor cycles to run the filtering. Filtering can be somewhat processor intensive depending on the type of filter that you're using. So anybody who has one of these gyro chips from InvenSense is going to be able to do low pass filtering just out of the box by letting the chip do the heavy lifting. The inbuilt low pass on the MCU chip is controlled by the gyro LPF parameter in Betaflight. The inbuilt low-pass filter has lots of delay. It's really not a very good low-pass for the kind of application we're using. And it has lots of delay, and it's only configurable in set increments, such as 42 Hz, 98 Hz, and 188 Hz. So you don't get a lot of configurability there, and it has a lot of delay. So it's not very good. I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's not very good. For a long time, the default for a clean flight was to fly with gyro LPF equals 42. And that was just where people were at. It was if you had less filtering than that, you would get so much noise that your PID loop would be out of control, right? If some people with very, very clean setups could start flying with 98 Hertz or even 188 Hertz and still have a controllable copter. And that actually was where the thought process started with the idea of coming up with Boris coming up with the soft filters, was that there were some pilots who were flying with gyro LPF equals 188, and the copter was really noisy, but it also felt really locked in and really well controlled, and that made people like Boris start going, well, how can we get this reduced delay while still having acceptable noise levels? Delay is bad. Delay is bad because it means that the PID loop is responding to copter motions that have already happened. So if the copter rolls to the left, and the PID loop needs to compensate for that by pushing it back to the right because it was an uncommanded roll, that needs to happen as soon as possible. If the PID loop is delayed, the copter will roll to the left, and then maybe it's rolling to the right again, and now the copter pushes it to roll to the right, compensating for that move that already happened, and now it's making things worse rather than better. So we want very little delay. And when we look at the default filter built into the MCU chip with a cutoff of like 42 Hertz, there's several milliseconds of delay of the gyro signal coming out of the chip relative to when that signal was actually sensed by the chip, and that's being imposed by the filter. The need to filter it creates some delay. So we want less delay. Low delay means a better flying copter, more locked-in feel, better control, better prop wash handling, etc. Gyro LPF should always be off. You should always have gyro LPF off if you're running anything. Clean flight, back to like Clean Flight 1.10, I think, is where the soft filters got rolled in Betaflight back to the very earliest days. Gyro LPF should basically always be off. You never use gyro LPF anymore. You always use the soft filters. The only reason that the soft filters might be bad is that they add processor utilization, but we don't care about that. We have plenty of processor cycles to run these filters. That's fine. That's not a problem. The Betaflight low-pass filters are gyro low-pass hertz. This used to be gyro soft LPF, and before that it was gyro cut hertz. It's had many different names. The current name is gyro low-pass hertz. It's a low-pass filter on the gyro data that is going into the PID loop. So the data comes out of the gyro, the MCU chip, and because we've turned off the filtering on the MCU, it's really almost completely unfiltered. It's actually not. Gyro LPF off does not actually completely disable filtering in the MCU. It's actually slightly filtered still, but it's not very much, and it's a very low delay. Gyro low-pass hertz then further filters that before the data goes into the PID loop. And since the PID calculations are based on the gyro data, filtering the gyro data before it gets to the PID loop is a good way of preventing the PID loop from seeing the noise that we don't want the PID loop to be thinking about at all. When we talk about these low-pass hertzes, we set this to a number, and this number, like gyro low-pass hertz, equals 100. That number is called the cutoff frequency of the filter, and it is, for the exact nature of the cutoff frequency depends on the type of filter. For a very simple first-order filter, the cutoff frequency will be the point where the signal has been reduced by 3 dB, and then there's a defined curve beyond which the signal will be reduced as you go up in frequency after that. So basically, the lower this number, the more filtering we have, because we are reducing more of the high frequencies because we're reducing more of the high frequencies. So a gyro low-pass hertz of 100 is less filtering than a gyro low-pass hertz of 80, is less filtering than a gyro low-pass hertz of 60. As that number goes down, you're filtering more. And that's a little counterintuitive, since you might think that higher numbers are filtering more because higher numbers are more, but because this is a low-pass filter, that's backwards. Lower numbers mean more filtering, okay? It's critical, back up. Because the gyro low-pass hertz filters the gyro data as it's entering the PID loop, gyro low-pass hertz does not change the time relationship between the individual elements of the PID loop. So in other words, the P term and the D term, and those are the two we're concerned with. The P term and the D term get the same gyro data. They've run their calculation on the gyro data. They're both acting on the exact same sample, if you will, of data. Okay. Now those samples are delayed relative to the real world by the gyro low-pass filter, but since they're delayed equally, that's critical for the D term. And the reason for that is it's critical that the D term remain in time with the P term. When the D term is in time with the P term, D helps P out. It damps when it's needed, it accelerates when it's needed. If the D term is delayed relative to the P term, it can actually get to the point where it's doing the opposite of what it should be doing. It's damping when it should accelerate, it's accelerating when it should damp, and basically this results in terrible flight characteristics, oscillation, overshoot, ringing, etc. So what we want is the D term can tolerate a little bit of delay relative to the P term. That's okay. If it's a little delayed, it can actually still do its job just fine. But it's best when the D term is not too much delayed relative to the P term. The dterm is actually the most in need of filtering because it amplifies noise, whereas the p-term responds linearly to noise, and the I-term actually filters noise out. The I-term is an integrator, and an integrator is a very simple form of low-pass filter, and that's why we never talk about filtering the I-term, because the I-term is itself already filtering, right? That's what it does. So the I-term works best. It's already filtering. That's why we never talk about filtering the I-term separately. But the dterm also suffers the most if it has too much delay relative to the p-term. Therefore, it's counterproductive to filter the dterm too heavily. Okay? So dterm needs a lot of filtering, but if we filter the dterm too much, then the delay accumulates to the point where d is out of phase or out of time with the p-term, and then it's making things worse, not better. So we've got this feature, this parameter, dterm low pass hertz, which used to be dterm LPF hertz and something else before that. And this is a low-pass filter on the dterm only. Lowering this value filters the dterm more heavily, but it also delays the dterm more relative to the p-term. So if dterm low-pass hertz was off, so we would set it to dterm low-pass hertz equals 0, there would be no additional filtering on the dterm, and the dterm would be perfectly in phase or perfectly timed with the p-term. Both the d and the p-term would be acting on the same gyro sample at the same time. But the flip side is that the dterm would be just crazy noisy, and you would have to reduce your d gains almost to nothing in order to keep the dterm from being so noisy that it made your motors hot, okay? At which point the dterm would not be very effective, right? So we add this additional filter on the dterm, which filters the dterm a little more and compensates for the fact that the dterm amplifies noise, but it also delays the dterm, okay? And then finally there's yaw low-pass hertz, which is a separate filter on the yaw axis data. And the reason for this is that the yaw axis is often much noisier than the pitch and roll axes. So if you were to tune your copter to the limits of the noisiest axis, then the yaw axis would limit the amount of tune you could get before the pitch and the roll axis were properly tuned, okay? So if you have a copter with a very noisy yaw axis, then you can use yaw low-pass hertz to filter the yaw axis only above and beyond what you're filtering on the other two axes. And that's the reason that only the yaw low-pass hertz exists, and there's not a separate one for pitch and roll low-pass. There's a world in which we actually had separate tuning parameters for all three axes. So you could have a gyro, a dterm filter for the pitch axis, a separate one for the roll axis, and a separate one for the yaw axis. And this would give a huge amount of tunability, but it would also be completely overwhelming for the vast majority of people who would just never take the time and effort to actually get it right. And that's why we don't have that. So how do you tune the filters? In general, less filtering, in other words, higher cutoff values, larger numbers, always results in better flight characteristics because it results in less delay. But less filtering lets in more noise, and if noise becomes unacceptable, motors become hot. This can be addressed primarily by reducing D-gain, since D-gain amplifies noise. In general, the P-gain is not super responsive to noise, so a very noisy copter, it's going to be a point where your P-term is limited, but primarily you're going to get problems with the D-term. The thing is, if you reduce your D-gain in response to excess noise, you can then start to get the bad characteristics that the D-term is supposed to compensate for. And if you watch my Practical PID Tuning series, the 5th video in that series, you can really see the effects of the D-term being at 0 and then being brought in, the kind of things it's controlling for. There's more to it than just rebound and oscillation at the end of flips and rolls. The D-term can generally sharpen up the feel of a copter, but the most obvious thing the D-term does is it gets rid of oscillation at the end of flips and rolls. So we could reduce filtering, but then noise will get in. So then we reduce D-gain, and then the copter starts flying worse. So there's a balance there. One way to think about tuning filters is that there's an inverse relationship between the amount of filtering and the amount of D-gain your setup can tolerate. If you have more filtering, then you can have more D-gain. If you have less filtering, then you have to have less D-gain. So one way to think about it is that you add just enough D-gain to get perfect flips and rolls, and then raise the filter cutoffs to let more noise in until the motors start to get warm but not hot. This is a real oversimplification because your optimal tune will change as your filters change. So if you've got your filters set at a really low cutoff value, so you're filtering relatively heavily, you're going to raise your D-gain up right? But then as you raise the filters, the motors may start to get hot. You may need a little more, a little less D gain, your P gain may need to change. So if you're really trying to get a really perfect tune, you may have a lot of trial and error there. But this is a general way of thinking about the relationship between D gain and filtering, and a way to sort of start thinking about what the right amount of filtering is for your setup. You could also come about this the other direction, which is you could set your filters at a very high value. In other words, you have almost no filtering at all, right? And then you're going to have your D gain very, very low, okay? And then you're going to start to raise your D gain until the point where you notice that your motors are starting to get hot. And at that point, you may need, if that's not enough D gain for you, if your copter is not flying perfect, and you say, nope, I need more D gain than this, then you lower the cutoff frequency to filter a little bit more. And so you can work your filters down as you work your D gain up to find the right amount where your motors aren't getting too hot and your copter is flying well. That's, I think, a good way to think about this. What about tuning the dterm filter versus the gyro filter? The gyro filter reduces noise and increases delay on all terms. The dterm is most affected by noise, therefore tuning the gyro filter until the dterm is happy, not too much noise, not too hot motors, will result in excess delay for the p term. The I term is inherently delayed, so just forget about it, that's normal. In other words, if we tune the gyro filter until the D term is happy, the P term will be undertuned and will be excessively delayed. So we want to use the D term filter. It's there and we want to use it. Remember that the D term can tolerate a little bit of delay relative to the P term without getting bad flight characteristics. It's only when there's excess delay of the D term relative to the P term that things get bad. And so there's a balance between filtering both the P and the D term with the gyro filter and filtering just the D term with the D term filter, where there's the right amount of both to get a good response for the P term and not too much delay for the D term. Finding the optimal balance requires a lot of trial and error. It's very difficult and requires a lot of testing of different values, and it also requires that you be able to tune a copter sort of to the edge and know when your D term is as high as it can go, and recognize the effects of excess filtering, excess delay, etc. This is something that most of us are not up to doing, and the best bet for most people is to use the suggested values in the Betaflight 270 release notes and the Betaflight wiki, and they give you suggested values for a very clean copter, a slightly noisy copter, a very noisy copter, and it says, you know, gyro LPF 100, D term LPF of 110. Just go, those ratios are really important. The fact, you know, why not gyro of 100 and a D term of 50? Well, that would be way too much delay, right? So go with the values that are suggested in the 270 release notes, and if the very clean copter version doesn't work for you, go for the slightly noisy copter version. But if you decide to go your own way and start trying to figure out exactly the right D term and the right gyro value relative to each other, that's a very challenging thing to get right. As for the yaw axis, add yaw axis filtering as needed if the yaw axis is particularly noisy compared to the pitch and roll axes, but leave yaw axis filtering off if possible. Less filtering, less delays, better flight characteristics. Since there's no D term on the yaw axis, then the timing relationship of P and D doesn't matter on this axis. There's no D at all. All we're doing is we're filtering the P term, right? So filtering on the yaw axis delays the gyro data of the yaw axis relative to reality. But since the yaw axis is usually not very oscillation prone to begin with, it's probably more tolerable than on the pitch and roll axes. The yaw axis is usually not super responsive, so we can probably tolerate a little bit more delay on the yaw axis than on the pitch and roll axes, and that means that it's probably safe to add some filtering on the yaw axis if you need to. It probably will not affect your overall flight characteristics as much as excess filtering on the pitch and roll axes. The final thought that I have, and I didn't put this in the notes or the slides, but the final thought that I have is you got to keep in mind that all of this stuff is relative to the noise level of your copter. If you have a copter that has a lot of vibration, then you're going to find you're going to need more filtering and less D gain. And if you have a copter that is tuned right on the edge, the situation you can find yourself in is that you crash, a motor gets out of balance or a prop gets out of balance, and suddenly a copter that was right on the edge and was tuned perfectly is now over the edge and has excess oscillation. And the symptom of this can be a copter that will not throttle down, If you have excess D-gain or excess noise or some combination of the two, you can raise the throttle and the copter will just kind of keep vibrating and flying even after you lower the throttle. So if you're going to tune a copter to the very edge with as little filtering as possible and as much D-gain as possible, be aware that you could easily get yourself in a situation after a crash. You crash, you bend your prop back, you decide to go fly, and now suddenly the copter's trying to fly away from you and won't come down. So keep that in mind. Well, I hope that's been helpful. Happy flying.